In the ancient libraries of Alexandria, before the flames consumed 200,000 scrolls of accumulated human knowledge, scholars debated a passage from the Book of Genesis that had troubled interpreters for centuries. The passage appeared in the 6th chapter of the Hebrew Scriptures, occupying just 4 verses that seemed to describe an event so extraordinary, so far beyond ordinary human experience, that generations of rabbis, priests and philosophers would wrestle with its implications without ever reaching consensus. The text described beings called the Nephilim, a Hebrew word whose precise meaning remains disputed to this day, who appeared on the earth in the ages before the great flood that destroyed all life except for the family of Noah. These Nephilim, according to the Genesis account, emerged from unions between the sons of God and the daughters of men, a genealogical statement whose interpretation would generate theological controversy spanning more than 3,000 years. The passage stated that these hybrid beings were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown, a description that suggested figures of extraordinary power and fame whose memory persisted in human consciousness long after the deluge supposedly erased all traces of their civilization. The rabbis of antiquity debated whether these sons of God were fallen angels who had descended from heaven to take human wives, or whether they represented a righteous line of Seth's descendants who had intermarried with the corrupt line of Cain. The question of the Nephilim's nature, their origin, their capabilities, and their ultimate fate would influence religious thought, mythological interpretation, and alternative historical speculation from the 3rd century before the Common Era to the present day. The textual tradition surrounding the Nephilim extended far beyond the brief mention in Genesis to encompass an entire literature of elaboration, speculation, and imaginative reconstruction. The Book of Enoch, a collection of apocalyptic writings attributed to the antediluvian patriarch, who was said to have walked with God and then vanished from the earth without dying, provided the most detailed account of the angelic descent and its catastrophic consequences. This text, which circulated widely among Jewish and early Christian communities before eventually being excluded from most biblical canons, named 200 angels who descended upon Mount Hermon in the days of Jared, the father of Enoch, and swore a mutual oath to take human wives despite knowing that their actions violated the fundamental order of creation. The leader of these fallen angels bore the name Semyaza, though some manuscripts identified the principal instigator as Azazel, a figure whose name would later become associated with the scapegoat ritual of the Day of Atonement. These angels, according to Enoch's testimony, taught humanity forbidden knowledge that accelerated technological and cultural development while simultaneously corrupting human society beyond the possibility of redemption. The offspring of these angelic human unions grew to enormous size, consuming the produce of humanity until the food supplies proved insufficient to sustain them, at which point they turned to devouring human beings themselves and drinking their blood. The violence and chaos unleashed by these hybrid giants eventually grew so severe that the earth itself cried out for divine intervention, prompting the heavenly council to dispatch the archangels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel to bind the fallen angels, destroy their monstrous offspring, and prepare the world for the cleansing flood that would sweep away all corrupted flesh. The geographical setting described in these ancient texts centered on the region that would later be known as the Levant, encompassing the modern territories of Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Mount Hermon, where the 200 fallen angels were said to have descended, rises to more than 9,000 feet above sea level, at the intersection of present-day Lebanon, Syria, and the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights, forming the southern terminus of the anti-Lebanon mountain range. The peak of Hermon bears perpetual snow throughout much of the year, making it visible from great distances across the surrounding lowlands and establishing its prominence as a landmark in the ancient world. Archaeological surveys of the mountain slopes have documented numerous temples and sacred enclosures constructed during various periods of antiquity, suggesting that the site maintained religious significance across multiple cultures and historical eras. The choice of Mount Hermon as the location for angelic descent may have reflected existing traditions associating the mountain with supernatural activity, or the traditions themselves may have developed to explain the mountain's obvious sacredness within the context of emerging Yahwistic theology. The Book of Enoch described the angels standing upon the summit and observing the daughters of men in the valleys below, their beauty-inspiring desires that the celestial beings had never before experienced. The decision to descend represented a fundamental violation of cosmic boundaries, a crossing of the threshold between heaven and earth that would introduce chaos into both realms and necessitate the eventual destruction of the entire antediluvian world. The catalogue of forbidden knowledge transmitted by the fallen angels to their human wives and children constituted an alternative history of human technological development that attributed key innovations to supernatural instruction rather than gradual human discovery. Azazel, according to the Enochian tradition, taught humanity the metallurgical arts required to manufacture swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, thereby introducing organised warfare on a scale previously unknown among the scattered human populations. The same angel revealed the techniques of extracting and working precious metals, enabling the creation of jewellery and ornamentation that inflamed human vanity and inspired conflict over material possessions. The fallen angels also transmitted knowledge of cosmetics and beauty enhancement, teaching women to paint their faces and adorn their bodies in ways that the Enochian authors associated with sexual immorality and social corruption. Other angels specialised in various forms of divination and occult practice, revealing the secrets of astrology, the interpretation of signs and omens, and the preparation of magical concoctions that could influence human behaviour or alter physical circumstances. The angel Penemu taught the art of writing, which the text characterised as knowledge that humanity had not originally been intended to possess, suggesting that literacy itself represented a form of forbidden wisdom that accelerated the corruption of human society. The comprehensive nature of this angelic curriculum implied that virtually every aspect of advanced civilization derived ultimately from supernatural revelation rather than natural human development, a theological position that simultaneously explained the existence of sophisticated technology and condemned it as fundamentally illegitimate. The physical characteristics attributed to the Nephilim in ancient sources emphasized their gigantic stature as the most obvious marker of their hybrid origin. The Book of Enoch stated that the offspring of angelic human unions grew to heights of 300 cubits, a measurement that would translate to approximately 450 feet if interpreted literally, though most scholars have understood this figure as rhetorical exaggeration, intended to convey magnitude rather than precise dimension. Other textual traditions provided more modest but still extraordinary estimates, with some sources describing giants of 9 or 12 cubits, corresponding to heights of approximately 14 to 18 feet. The Book of Giants, another text from the Enochian corpus that survived only in fragmentary form among the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran, provided names and brief characterizations for individual Nephilim, including figures called Oya, Hahya, Malwe, and Gilgamesh, the latter name establishing an explicit connection between the Hebrew giant tradition and the Mesopotamian epic hero. These giants dreamed prophetic dreams of their own destruction, seeing tablets inscribed with the names of all living creatures being cast into water and cleansed of all but 3 names, a clear prefiguration of the flood that would spare only Noah and his immediate family. The consciousness attributed to these giants suggested that they possessed not merely physical superiority, but intellectual and spiritual capacities that made them aware of their transgressive origins and their inevitable doom, trapped between heavenly and earthly existence without belonging fully to either realm. The appetite of the Nephilim, according to the Enochian literature, grew in proportion to their enormous bodies until their consumption exceeded the productive capacity of human agriculture. The text described the giants devouring the labour of all humanity, eating the food that men produced until nothing remained, at which point they turned against humanity itself and began consuming human flesh. The giants also consumed animals and birds, drank blood in violation of divine prohibition, and committed acts of violence and predation that transformed the earth into a realm of terror and suffering. This characterization of the Nephilim as monstrous predators departed significantly from the Genesis description of mighty men of renown, suggesting that the Enochian authors sought to explain why divine destruction of the giants was both justified and necessary. The corruption introduced by the fallen angels had penetrated so deeply into the fabric of earthly existence that no partial remedy could suffice, and only complete annihilation of all flesh except for the single, righteous family of Noah could restore the earth to conditions suitable for the divine plan. The violence of the Nephilim served as the immediate cause of the flood within this theological framework, explaining the destruction of the antediluvian world as a direct consequence of angelic transgression, rather than simply human sinfulness. The fate of the fallen angels themselves, as distinct from their giant offspring, involved imprisonment rather than annihilation, a punishment that the Enochian texts described in elaborate detail. The archangel Raphael received instructions to bind Azazel hand and foot, cast him into a pit in the desert of Dudael, cover him with sharp stones, and leave him in darkness until the great day of judgment, at which time he would be consigned to eternal fire. The leader Semyaza and his companions were bound for 70 generations beneath the hills of the earth, imprisoned in valleys of fire where they would remain until the final judgment brought them forth for their ultimate condemnation. The angels were compelled to witness the destruction of their beloved children, the Nephilim, who slaughtered each other in internecine warfare that the archangel Michael had fomented as part of the divine plan for their elimination. The spirits of the dead giants, however, did not pass out of existence entirely, but continued to roam the earth as evil spirits, afflicting humanity and causing suffering until the day of consummation, when all injustice would finally be judged. This explanation of demonic origins established a direct connection between the antediluvian angelic descent and the ongoing experience of spiritual affliction that characterized human existence throughout subsequent ages, suggesting that the consequences of the Nephilim's birth continued to affect the world long after the flood had destroyed their physical forms. The geographical distribution of giant traditions across the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world suggested either widespread awareness of the Nephilim narrative or independent development of remarkably similar mythological themes in multiple cultures. The Hebrew scriptures beyond Genesis contain numerous references to giant peoples who inhabited the lands of Canaan before the Israelite conquest, including the Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzumim, and the Anakim, groups that some interpreters identified as descendants or survivors of the original Nephilim despite the universal destruction supposedly accomplished by the flood. The Book of Numbers described Israelite spies returning from reconnaissance of Canaan, with reports of the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, a statement that explicitly identified the indigenous population with the antediluvian giants and explained Israelite reluctance to invade the Promised Land. The giant Goliath of Gath, whose combat with the young David became one of the most famous narratives in biblical literature, measured 6 cubits and a span according to the traditional Hebrew text, a height of approximately 9 feet 6 inches that placed him within the range of extreme but not absolutely impossible human stature. Other Philistine warriors of extraordinary size appeared in the biblical accounts of David's reign, including Ishbi-Benob, Saph, and an unnamed warrior with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, physical anomalies that ancient interpreters associated with giant ancestry and residual Nephilim bloodlines. The Greek mythological tradition preserved accounts of giant beings whose characteristics paralleled the Hebrew descriptions of the Nephilim in numerous respects, raising questions about cultural transmission, common inheritance, or independent mythogenesis. The Titans of Greek mythology, the elder gods who ruled before the Olympian deities overthrew them, possessed enormous size and strength that made them formidable opponents even for Zeus and his divine siblings. The Gigantomachy, the war between the Olympian gods and the giants born from Gaia, resulted in the imprisonment of the defeated giants beneath mountains and volcanoes, an outcome remarkably similar to the Enochian account of fallen angels bound beneath the hills of the earth. The Greek hero Heracles, whose labours required superhuman strength and endurance, traced his lineage to divine parentage through Zeus, establishing him as a demigod whose hybrid nature enabled feats beyond ordinary human capacity. The Homeric heroes who fought at Troy displayed capabilities that suggested more than human ancestry, with Achilles, Ajax, and Hector performing acts of strength and combat prowess that later generations found difficult to credit without assuming divine admixture in their genealogies. The Greek traditions did not characterize these hybrid figures as uniformly monstrous in the manner of the Enochian Nephilim, instead portraying them as heroic figures whose divine parentage elevated rather than corrupted their essential humanity, a significant divergence in theological interpretation that reflected different cultural attitudes toward the intersection of divine and human realms. The Mesopotamian literary tradition, from which many scholars believe the Hebrew writers drew substantial influence, contained its own accounts of antediluvian figures whose characteristics suggested extraordinary or supernatural origin. The Sumerian king list enumerated rulers who reigned before the flood for periods extending to tens of thousands of years, lifespans that implied either radically different temporal reckoning or qualitatively distinct modes of existence. The epic hero Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, stood 11 cubits tall according to one text, approximately 16 feet in height, and possessed strength sufficient to perform feats that no ordinary human could accomplish. The explicit inclusion of Gilgamesh among the name Nephilim in the Book of Giants demonstrated ancient awareness of connections between the Hebrew and Mesopotamian giant traditions, though the precise nature of that relationship, whether literary borrowing, common cultural heritage, or parallel mythological development, remains subject to scholarly debate. The Mesopotamian flood narrative, preserved in both Sumerian and Akkadian versions, described divine destruction of humanity motivated by excessive noise and overpopulation rather than moral corruption, a different causal framework that nevertheless resulted in the same outcome of universal destruction and single-family survival. The Mesopotamian traditions thus provided a comparative context within which the Hebrew Nephilim narrative could be understood as one regional variant of a widespread Near Eastern complex of myths concerning antediluvian giants, divine human interaction, and catastrophic flood. The physical evidence adduced by various interpreters to support the historical reality of the Nephilim has ranged from archaeological discoveries of large skeletal remains to architectural monuments whose construction seemed to require more than ordinary human capabilities. The so-called giant skeletons allegedly discovered at numerous locations throughout North America, the Middle East, and other regions became staples of 19th and early 20th century popular literature, though scientific examination of verifiable claims consistently revealed either misidentification of animal remains, exaggeration of human skeletal dimensions, or outright fabrication. The megalithic structures of the ancient world, including the pyramids of Egypt, the trilithon stones of Baalbek in Lebanon, and the Cyclopean walls of Mycenaean Greece, inspired speculation that their construction required either lost technologies or builders of superhuman strength, speculation that some interpreters connected to Nephilim presence in the antediluvian or early post-diluvian world. The platform at Baalbek incorporated individual stones weighing more than 1,000 tons, quarried and transported from sources nearly a mile distant, and fitted together with precision that continued to impress modern engineers who studied the site. The temple complex constructed upon this platform served the worship of various Semitic and Roman deities over many centuries, though the underlying platform itself predated the known temple structures and remained of uncertain origin and purpose within conventional archaeological frameworks. The theological significance of the Nephilim narrative within the broader structure of Hebrew scriptural thought centered on questions of cosmic order, divine human boundaries, and the consequences of transgression across categorical distinctions. The creation account in Genesis established a universe organized according to fundamental categories, separating light from darkness, waters above from waters below, land from sea, and different kinds of living creatures each reproducing according to its own kind. The descent of the sons of God to mate with the daughters of men violated this categorical structure by crossing the boundary between heavenly and earthly beings, producing offspring that belonged fully to neither realm and whose existence threatened the coherence of the created order. The Genesis narrative placed this angelic descent immediately before the flood account, establishing a causal or at minimum correlational relationship between boundary transgression and divine judgment. The corruption of all flesh that the text cited as justification for the flood extended beyond merely human sinfulness, to encompass the disruption of natural categories that the Nephilim embodied, suggesting that their hybrid existence constituted a form of cosmic pollution that required purification through total destruction. This theological framework explained why the flood needed to be universal rather than local, destroying all life rather than merely the guilty parties, since the categorical confusion introduced by angelic descent had contaminated the entire created order rather than merely specific individuals or communities. The early Christian interpretation of the Nephilim passage drew on both Jewish traditions and emerging theological concerns specific to the new religious movement. The Apostle Peter's second letter contained a brief reference to angels who sinned and were cast into Tartarus, a Greek term for the underworld that the author employed to describe their place of imprisonment until judgment, a passage that most interpreters understood as alluding to the fallen angels of the Enochian tradition. The letter of Jude provided a slightly fuller account describing angels who did not keep their proper domain but abandoned their own dwelling, and who were kept in eternal chains under darkness until the judgment of the great day. language that closely paralleled the Enochian descriptions of angelic imprisonment. The early church fathers debated the interpretation of these passages and their relationship to the Genesis text, with some authorities accepting the angelic interpretation, while others preferred to understand the sons of God as descendants of Seth, whose intermarriage with Canaanite women produced moral rather than biological corruption. The influential theologian Augustine of Hippo rejected the angelic interpretation in his City of God, arguing that spiritual beings could not produce physical offspring with humans, and that the giants mentioned in Genesis were simply large human beings, whose size resulted from natural variation rather than supernatural parentage. Augustine's position became dominant in Western Christianity, though the angelic interpretation continued to circulate in various heterodox and popular traditions throughout the medieval period and beyond. The Jewish interpretive tradition preserved multiple perspectives on the Nephilim question, with rabbinic authorities debating the nature of the sons of God, the character of the giants, and the relationship between antediluvian corruption and subsequent history. The Targums, Aramaic paraphrases of the Hebrew scriptures produced for synagogue use, rendered the Hebrew term for sons of God in various ways that reflected different interpretive positions, with some versions employing language suggesting angelic beings, and others using terms that implied human judges or aristocrats. The Midrashic literature elaborated on the Nephilim narrative with imaginative details concerning the giants' behaviour, their interactions with antediluvian humanity, and their ultimate fate in the flood and thereafter. One tradition described the giant Og of Bashan, the Amorite king defeated by Moses according to the Book of Deuteronomy, as a survivor of the flood who clung to the outside of Noah's Ark throughout the deluge, an account that explained how giant bloodlines persisted into the post-Diluvian world despite the universal destruction. The mystical traditions of Kabbalah incorporated the fallen angel narrative into complex cosmological frameworks involving multiple levels of reality, emanations from the divine source, and disruptions in the cosmic order that required tikkun or repair through human spiritual practice. The Zohar, the central text of medieval Kabbalah, discussed the fallen angels and their offspring within its elaborate symbolic system, interpreting the Nephilim narrative as encoding truths about the structure of reality that transcended its historical or mythological surface meaning. The Islamic tradition preserved its own accounts of fallen angels and antediluvian events that paralleled and diverged from the Jewish and Christian versions in significant ways. The Quran mentioned angels named Harut and Marut, who descended to Babylon and taught humanity magic, though Islamic interpreters debated whether these figures should be identified with the fallen angels of the Enochian tradition or understood as distinct entities with different characteristics and purposes. The Islamic accounts generally portrayed the angelic descent as a divine test, rather than an act of rebellion, with Harut and Marut receiving permission to descend to earth on the condition that they avoid certain sins, a test they ultimately failed through succumbing to the beauty of a human woman. The giant traditions of Islamic literature included accounts of the peoples of Ad and Thamud, destroyed by divine judgment for their arrogance and refusal to heed prophetic warning, though these traditions did not typically connect these peoples explicitly to angelic ancestry in the manner of the Hebrew Nephilim narrative. The cross-cultural distribution of giant and fallen angel traditions across the Abrahamic religions demonstrated the widespread influence of these narrative themes, while also highlighting the diversity of interpretive frameworks within which the basic motifs could be elaborated and understood. The modern reception of the Nephilim narrative has extended far beyond traditional religious interpretation to encompass alternative history speculation, ancient astronaut theories, and various forms of popular cultural engagement. The ancient astronaut hypothesis, which proposed that extraterrestrial beings visited Earth in antiquity and were misremembered as gods or angels by primitive human populations, found in the Nephilim narrative a particularly compelling piece of evidence for its claims. The descent of the sons of God from the heavens, their transmission of advanced knowledge to humanity, and the hybrid offspring they produced with human women could all be reinterpreted within this framework as describing extraterrestrial contact, genetic engineering, and the creation of hybrid species that the ancient authors understood in supernatural rather than technological terms. The Book of Enoch's detailed accounts of heavenly journeys, celestial architecture, and cosmic geography provided additional material for alternative interpretive frameworks that sought to decode ancient religious texts as garbled transmissions of technological or scientific information. The connection between the Nephilim and the Anunnaki, The Sumerian deities, whose name meant those who from heaven came down, established a bridge between Hebrew and Mesopotamian traditions that alternative historians exploited extensively, arguing that both cultures preserved variant memories of the same extraterrestrial visitation. The intersection of Nephilim speculation with broader concerns about hidden history, suppressed knowledge, and alternative paradigms of human origins has made this narrative complex a persistent feature of contemporary popular culture and fringe discourse. The giants of the Nephilim tradition appeared in numerous novels, films, video games, and other media products that drew on biblical and apocryphal sources while adapting them to contemporary entertainment conventions. The internet enabled the rapid dissemination of claims concerning giant skeletal discoveries, Nephilim bloodlines persisting into modern populations, and conspiracies to suppress evidence of pre-flood civilizations, claims that circulated through social media, video platforms, and specialized websites devoted to alternative historical investigation. The academic study of the Nephilim narrative proceeded independently of these popular appropriations, with scholars examining the texts within their ancient Near Eastern contexts, tracing the development of interpretive traditions across religious communities and historical periods, and analysing the literary and theological functions of the giant motifs within the canonical and apocryphal literature. The divergence between scholarly and popular approaches to the Nephilim material reflected broader tensions between academic and alternative epistemologies, tensions that the internet and social media amplified by enabling direct access to primary sources and interpretive communities outside traditional institutional frameworks. The narrative structure of the Nephilim tradition, moving from heavenly origins through earthly transgression to catastrophic judgment and ongoing spiritual consequences, provided a comprehensive explanatory framework that addressed questions of human nature, technological development, and cosmic order. The tradition explained the existence of evil and suffering in the world as consequences of angelic rebellion and categorical transgression, locating the source of corruption outside human responsibility while simultaneously implicating humanity through the willing participation of the daughters of men in unions with celestial beings. The tradition provided an alternative account of technological and cultural progress that attributed key innovations to supernatural revelation rather than gradual human discovery, simultaneously validating advanced civilization and condemning it as fundamentally illegitimate. The tradition explained the existence of demonic spirits as the disembodied remnants of the destroyed Nephilim, connecting antediluvian events to ongoing human experience of spiritual affliction and supernatural influence. The comprehensiveness of this explanatory framework, addressing origins, development, catastrophe, and continuing consequences within a unified narrative structure, contributed to its persistent appeal across religious communities and historical periods, providing answers to questions that alternative frameworks addressed less satisfactorily or not at all. The Mount Hermon of ancient tradition, where the 200 fallen angels descended and swore their fateful oath, continues to rise above the landscapes of the modern Levant, its snow-capped peak visible from the populated regions below, where millions of people pursue their daily lives largely unaware of the mountain's significance within this ancient narrative complex. The archaeological remains scattered across the mountain slopes testify to the continuous habitation and worship that characterized the site throughout antiquity, though the specific connections between these remains and the traditions recorded in texts like the Book of Enoch remain matters of scholarly investigation rather than established fact. The temples dedicated to various deities, the sacred enclosures marking boundaries between profane and sacred space, and the inscriptions invoking divine protection and blessing, all point to Mount Hermon's status as a place of special significance within the religious geography of the ancient world. Whether this significance derived from traditions concerning angelic descent, or whether the angelic descent traditions developed to explain the mountain's existing sacredness, the connection between place and narrative has persisted across the millennia, separating the composition of the ancient text from the present day. The valleys spreading outward from Mount Hermon's base, where the daughters of men supposedly attracted the attention of the watching angels, supported agricultural populations throughout antiquity, whose labour sustained the cities and temples of the ancient Near Eastern civilizations. These were the people whose food the Nephilim consumed, whose lives the giants destroyed, and whose entire world disappeared beneath the waters of the Great Flood. the biblical chronology placed these events approximately 16 centuries before the birth of Abraham, locating the antediluvian period in an era so remote from historical memory that only divine revelation could provide information about its character and events. The genealogies connecting Noah to Adam spanned 10 generations of extraordinary longevity, with individuals living for centuries before producing offspring and continuing for additional centuries thereafter, a pattern that raised obvious questions about the relationship between antediluvian and post-diluvian human experience. Whether these genealogies recorded literal history, conveyed symbolic or theological truth through numerical patterns, or preserved garbled memories of actual populations whose existence archaeology might someday confirm, the texts themselves presented a coherent narrative of human origins, corruption, and renewal that continued to shape religious thought and popular imagination in the present day. The flood that brought the antediluvian world to its catastrophic conclusion represented within the Nephilim tradition not merely a divine response to general human wickedness, but a specific intervention designed to address the consequences of angelic transgression and the existence of the hybrid beings whose presence had corrupted the earth beyond ordinary remediation. The biblical text stated that the earth was filled with violence because of the Nephilim, establishing a direct causal connection between the existence of these beings and the conditions that necessitated their destruction through universal deluge. The Watchers had not merely sinned against heaven through their descent and their oath sworn on Mount Hermon, but had introduced into the created order a category of being that violated the fundamental distinctions upon which cosmic order depended, producing offspring whose very existence represented an ongoing challenge to the integrity of divine creation. The flood therefore functioned within this interpretive framework as a cleansing operation designed to eliminate the contaminated population and restore the conditions necessary for the continuation of human history according to divine intention, though the tradition preserved in texts like 1st Enoch suggested that the consequences of angelic transgression could never be entirely eliminated within the present age. The preservation of Noah and his family through the flood represented within this narrative complex the continuation of an uncontaminated human lineage capable of repopulating the earth following the destruction of the Nephilim and their human associates. Genesis described Noah as a righteous man, blameless in his generations, who walked with God, terminology that later interpreters understood as indicating not merely moral perfection, but genetic purity, the preservation of fully human lineage untainted by the admixture of angelic blood that had corrupted the broader antediluvian population. The specific reference to Noah's blamelessness in his generations suggested to these interpreters a genealogical concern beyond the immediate question of individual moral character, implying that Noah's ancestry had remained free from the contamination that characterized the descendants of those human women who had borne children to the fallen angels. This interpretation found support in the broader biblical emphasis on genealogical purity and the dangers of improper mixing between categories of beings, themes that resonated throughout the Hebrew scriptures, from the prohibition against yoking different animals together to the restrictions on intermarriage between Israelites and surrounding peoples. The mechanics of the flood itself received extensive elaboration in both biblical and extra-biblical sources, with the Genesis account describing the opening of the windows of heaven and the breaking up of the fountains of the great deep as the sources of the waters that covered the earth. The cosmology underlying this description conceived of the habitable world as existing within a protected space surrounded by waters above and below, waters that the creative action of God had restrained and ordered during the initial creation, but which could be released when divine judgment required the dissolution of the created order. The 40 days and 40 nights of rainfall, combined with the bursting forth of subterranean waters, produced a flood that rose above the highest mountains, eliminating every breathing creature that moved upon the face of the earth, except for those preserved within the ark that Noah had constructed according to divine specification. The Nephilim, despite their enormous size and superhuman strength, could not survive the universal inundation that left no high ground upon which they might take refuge, their physical prowess insufficient against the cosmic forces unleashed by divine decree. The traditions preserved in 1st Enoch and related texts provided additional details concerning the fate of the Watchers themselves during and after the flood, details that addressed the theological problem posed by the immortal nature of angelic beings, who could not simply perish like their hybrid offspring. The archangels sent to execute divine judgment bound the leader Shemhazzar and his associates in valleys of the earth until the day of great judgment, confining them in darkness and isolation, while their Nephilim children destroyed one another in the violence that preceded the flood, and their spirits became the demons that would afflict humanity throughout subsequent ages. The punishment of the Watchers thus continued beyond the immediate antediluvian period, extending into the present and future until the final consummation, when they would be cast into eternal fire, along with all other beings that had rebelled against divine authority. This understanding of angelic punishment provided a framework for understanding ongoing spiritual warfare as connected to events that had occurred in the distant past, linking contemporary human experience of demonic activity to the consequences of the Watcher's original transgression. The post-diluvian world that emerged after the floodwaters receded presented immediate problems for interpreters who took the Nephilim traditions seriously, given the explicit biblical statement that the flood had destroyed all flesh, in which was the breath of life from under heaven. Numbers 13 described the Anakim dwelling in Canaan as descendants of the Nephilim, implying either that some Nephilim had survived the flood, or that the process of angelic descent and interbreeding had repeated itself during the post-diluvian period. The biblical text stated that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, language that some interpreters understood as indicating two distinct periods of angelic human interbreeding separated by the flood event. This interpretation allowed for the destruction of the original Nephilim while explaining the presence of giant populations in Canaan during the period of Israelite conquest, though it raised additional questions about why divine judgment had not prevented or immediately punished this second occurrence of the original transgression. The giant clans described in the Hebrew scriptures as inhabiting Canaan and the surrounding regions during the second millennium before the Common Era received detailed attention within traditions that connected them to the antediluvian Nephilim. The Anakim, whose name derived from a Hebrew root meaning neck or necklace, possibly referring to their great height, or to ornaments they wore, dwelt in the hill country of Canaan, and particularly in the city of Hebron, where the spies sent by Moses encountered them and reported to the Israelite assembly that the land devoured its inhabitants, and that the people dwelling there were of great stature. The comparison of the Israelites to grasshoppers in the sight of the Anakim established the enormous scale differential between ordinary humans and these descendants of the Nephilim, a difference so profound that military victory against them seemed inconceivable through normal means. The Rephaim, mentioned throughout the Hebrew scriptures as both a giant population and a term for the shades of the dead in the underworld, inhabited the region east of the Jordan River, and included among their number the kings Og of Bashan and Sihon of the Amorites, whom the Israelites defeated during their wilderness wandering. The description of Og's iron bedstead as measuring 9 cubits in length and 4 cubits in width, approximately 13.5 feet by 6 feet according to the royal cubit, testified to the extraordinary physical dimensions of these post-diluvian giants whose existence continued the biological legacy of antediluvian transgression. The Emim and the Zamzummim represented additional giant populations mentioned in Deuteronomy as having inhabited the territories later occupied by Moab and Ammon respectively, populations that the biblical text explicitly connected to the Rephaim through the statement that these were also counted as Rephaim like the Anakim, but the Moabites called them Emim, and the Ammonites called them Zamzummim. The multiplicity of names for apparently related giant populations suggested either that different tribes had encountered and named the same beings according to their own linguistic conventions, or that the giant category encompassed multiple distinct populations sharing the common characteristic of enormous physical stature and presumably the common ancestry traced back to angelic human interbreeding. The geographical distribution of these giants across the entire region that would become significant in Israelite history, from the hill country of Canaan through the Transjordan to the territories of Moab and Ammon, implied that the post-diluvian presence of Nephilim descendants was not an isolated phenomenon, but a widespread feature of the ancient Near Eastern population during the period preceding Israelite emergence. The Philistine giants encountered by David and his mighty men during the United Monarchy period represented the latest biblical attestation of Nephilim descendants, individuals described as born to the giant in Gath, whose physical characteristics and military prowess mark them as belonging to the same category as the earlier Anakim and Rephaim. Goliath of Gath, whose height the Masoretic text recorded as 6 cubits and a span, approximately 9 feet 9 inches, challenged the Israelite army to single combat in a confrontation that the biblical narrative presented as a contest between the God of Israel and the gods of the Philistines, rather than merely a military engagement between human opponents. The detailed description of Goliath's armour and weapons, including a bronze helmet, bronze scale armour weighing 5,000 shekels, bronze greaves, a bronze javelin, and an iron spear whose head weighed 600 shekels, emphasised the overwhelming material advantage that this giant warrior possessed against any ordinary human opponent. David's victory through the unconventional means of a sling and stone, striking Goliath in the forehead and killing him with the weapon of a shepherd rather than the armament of a warrior, demonstrated divine intervention in the contest and established the pattern by which Israel would prevail against adversaries whose physical and material resources far exceeded their own. The theological significance of Israelite conflict with giant populations extended beyond the immediate military context to encompass the broader question of Israel's relationship to the Nephilim legacy that these populations represented. The command to devote the giant clans to total destruction, herem in Hebrew, treated them as belonging to a category of being whose existence was fundamentally incompatible with the divine purposes being worked out through Israel's establishment in the Promised Land. The extermination of the Anakim from the hill country by Joshua, and of the remaining giants in Gath and its territories by David and his warriors, represented the completion of a divine program to eliminate the surviving vestiges of angelic-human hybridization from the region where Israel would establish its kingdom. This interpretation located the Israelite conquest within the broader cosmic narrative of divine response to the Watcher's transgression, understanding the wars against Canaan as continuation of the cleansing operation, begun by the flood but left incomplete by the survival or re-emergence of Nephilim populations in the post-Diluvian world. The extra-biblical traditions preserved in the Book of Jubilees, composed during the 2nd century before the Common Era, provided an extensive account of the post-Diluvian period that addressed the question of demonic activity and its relationship to the destroyed Nephilim. According to Jubilees, the spirits of the slain giants, being begotten of angels but possessing no physical bodies after their deaths, became evil spirits on the earth that afflicted humanity through illness, accident, and moral corruption. Noah prayed to God to bind these spirits and remove them from among his descendants, but the leader of the demons, called Mastema in this text, successfully petitioned for 1/10 of the spirits to remain on earth under his command to execute judgment and punishment among humanity until the day of great judgment. This theological framework explained the continued existence of demonic activity in the post-Diluvian world as directly connected to the consequences of Watcher transgression, understanding the evil spirits that plagued humanity as the disembodied remnants of the Nephilim whose bodies had perished in the violence preceding the flood and in the flood itself. The connection between Nephilim destruction and demonic origin provided within traditions like Jubilees and 1st Enoch a comprehensive explanation for phenomena that the biblical text itself addressed only obliquely or not at all. The existence of spirits that could influence human thought, afflict human bodies with disease, and prompt human beings toward destructive behavior required some account of their origin and nature, an account that the Nephilim traditions supplied through the mechanism of hybrid beings whose spiritual components survived their physical destruction. The giants had been begotten through the union of angelic and human natures, possessing both the immortal spiritual substance inherited from their celestial fathers and the mortal physical bodies inherited from their human mothers, a combination that produced beings whose deaths did not result in the complete cessation of their existence, but only in the dissolution of their material form. The spirits thus released into the earth possessed the knowledge and powers their angelic fathers had taught them while lacking the physical constraints that had limited their activity during their embodied existence, making them more dangerous to humanity than they had been during their physical lives. The demonological implications of the Nephilim tradition exerted substantial influence on Jewish and Christian understandings of spiritual warfare throughout antiquity and into subsequent periods. The Testament of Solomon, a pseudepigraphal text attributed to the wise king who built the Jerusalem temple, described Solomon's interrogation and binding of demons, who revealed their names, functions, and methods of afflicting humanity, information that enabled the king to deploy them in the temple construction, while protecting his workers from their malevolent influence. Several of the demons in this text identified themselves as having originated from giant or angelic parentage, explicitly connecting the demonological system of the Testament to the Nephilim traditions preserved in earlier texts. The practical implications of this connection extended to the development of exorcistic formulas and protective prayers that invoked the binding of the Watchers and their offspring as precedent for the binding of demons, afflicting contemporary sufferers, understanding the authority exercised by God against the fallen angels as available to authorized human agents in the ongoing struggle against demonic powers. The early Christian communities inherited and developed the Nephilim traditions, according to their own theological concerns, reading the antediluvian events through the lens of Christological and eschatological commitments that transformed the significance of the ancient narratives while preserving their essential structure. The second epistle of Peter and the epistle of Jude, canonical texts composed during the 1st century of the Common Era, both reference the punishment of the angels who sinned as examples of divine judgment that assured the eventual punishment of the wicked in the present age. 2 Peter stated that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus and committed them to chains of deepest darkness, to be kept until the judgment, employing the Greek mythological term for the deepest region of the underworld to describe the place of angelic confinement. Jude similarly referenced the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, whom God had kept in eternal chains in deepest darkness for the judgment of the great day. Language that echoed the punishments described in 1st Enoch, while adapting them to the rhetorical purposes of Christian moral exhortation. The connection that Jude established between the punishment of the sinning angels and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah provided an important hermeneutical key for understanding the nature of angelic transgression within early Christian interpretation. The text stated that these angels acted like Sodom and Gomorrah in pursuing unnatural lust, literally going after other flesh, language that identified sexual transgression as the specific character of their sin rather than mere disobedience or pride. This interpretation aligned with the reading of Genesis 6 that understood the sons of God as angelic beings, whose descent to human women constituted a violation of the categorical boundaries separating celestial from terrestrial existence, a violation whose sexual character made it parallel to the sexual abominations of the cities of the plain. The punishment of eternal fire awaiting both the angels and the cities demonstrated the severity with which God regarded transgressions of this categorical nature, providing a warning to Christians who might be tempted to similar violations of divinely established boundaries. The apocalyptic traditions that flourished within early Christianity drew extensively upon the Nephilim narrative complex in developing their understanding of the cosmic struggle between divine and demonic forces that characterized the present age and would reach its climax in the events surrounding Christ's return. The Book of Revelation, with its descriptions of spiritual warfare in the heavenly places, the casting down of Satan and his angels, and the final judgment of all beings that had rebelled against divine authority, presupposed a cosmology in which angelic rebellion and its consequences remained active factors in the determination of human and cosmic history. The binding of Satan for 1,000 years, and his subsequent release for the final conflict before his eternal punishment echoed the pattern established in the Enochic literature regarding the binding and eventual judgment of the Watchers, suggesting that the Christian apocalypticists understood the eschatological events they anticipated as the completion of judgments that had begun in the antediluvian period but would not reach their full realization until the end of the present age. The patristic period witnessed extensive debate concerning the proper interpretation of the Genesis 6 passage and the traditions that had developed around it, debates that would eventually result in the marginalization of the angelic interpretation within mainstream Christian theology despite its clear attestation in the New Testament epistles. The alternative reading that identified the sons of God as descendants of Seth and the daughters of men as descendants of Cain gained adherents among influential church fathers who found the idea of angelic human sexual unions theologically problematic or philosophically impossible. Julius Africanus, writing in the early 3rd century, and Augustine of Hippo, whose City of God would exert enormous influence on subsequent Western theology, both rejected the angelic interpretation in favour of the Sethite reading that located the transgression entirely within human genealogical categories. The arguments against angelic interpretation typically emphasize the spiritual nature of angels, which was held to preclude the biological processes necessary for reproduction, and the theological implications of suggesting that the created order contained within it the possibility of such categorical violation. The rejection of the angelic interpretation by influential theologians did not eliminate the Nephilim traditions from Christian consciousness, but rather drove them into alternative channels, where they continued to develop and exert influence outside the boundaries of officially sanctioned theological discourse. The Byzantine chroniclers, who compiled universal histories from creation to their own time, frequently incorporated material from the Enochic literature concerning the Watchers and their offspring. Understanding this material as providing genuine historical information about the antediluvian period that supplemented the canonical biblical account. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, which preserved 1st Enoch as canonical scripture, maintained the angelic interpretation without interruption, understanding the fallen Watchers and their Nephilim offspring as integral elements of sacred history rather than problematic additions requiring reinterpretation or rejection. The medieval European traditions concerning giants, while drawing upon classical sources such as the Greek Gigantes and the Latin tradition of the giants, who warred against the Olympian gods, also incorporated elements from the biblical and parabiblical Nephilim traditions, producing hybrid accounts that located giant populations within the broader framework of salvation history. The transmission of these hybrid traditions across the medieval period created interpretive frameworks within which the Nephilim and their gigantic offspring could be understood simultaneously as biblical figures attested by sacred scripture, as historical populations whose physical remains could still be discovered, and as mythological beings whose stories illuminated fundamental truths about the human condition and the cosmic order within which humanity existed. The chroniclers and encyclopedists who compiled the great summaries of knowledge that characterized medieval intellectual culture approached the question of giants with methodological assumptions quite different from those that would emerge in later periods, understanding the testimony of ancient sources, whether biblical, classical, or patristic, as providing reliable information about past conditions that could not be directly observed but could be reconstructed through careful attention to authoritative texts. The acceptance of giants as genuine historical beings was not a matter of naive credulity, but rather reflected the epistemological frameworks within which medieval scholars operated, frameworks that privileged written testimony over empirical observation and understood the ancient world as characterized by conditions no longer directly accessible to contemporary experience. The physical evidence for ancient giants that medieval and early modern observers believed they had discovered took the form of oversized bones unearthed during construction projects, agricultural activities, or deliberate excavation of sites associated with legendary accounts of giant populations. The interpretation of these bones as the remains of antediluvian or post-diluvian giants proceeded naturally from the theoretical frameworks within which observers understood natural history, frameworks that had not yet developed the comparative anatomical methods that would eventually allow the identification of such remains as belonging to elephants, mastodons, or other large mammals whose populations had become extinct or geographically restricted since ancient times. The giant bone discoveries reported throughout the medieval and early modern periods consistently generated interpretations that connected the physical evidence to the biblical and classical traditions concerning giant populations, with the specific identifications varying according to local legendary associations and the particular textual authorities considered most relevant to the interpretation of the finds. The remains discovered near Trapani in Sicily during the 14th century were identified with the Cyclops Polyphemus, whose legendary cave dwelling on the island provided the geographical connection necessary for linking the physical evidence to the classical tradition. The bones discovered in Valencia during the 15th century were associated with the biblical giants mentioned in Genesis and the conquest narratives, demonstrating the persistence of the Nephilim tradition as an interpretive framework for understanding physical evidence that seemed to confirm the historical reality of populations significantly larger than contemporary humanity. The theological implications of giant traditions received sustained attention from scholastic thinkers who sought to integrate the various authoritative sources concerning giants into coherent systematic frameworks compatible with the broader principles of Christian doctrine. The question of whether angels possess the capacity for sexual reproduction with human beings, which the mainstream Western tradition had answered negatively following Augustine, continued to generate alternative interpretations among thinkers who found the patristic arguments against such possibility less than fully convincing, or who encountered the Enochic traditions through channels that preserved the angelic interpretation without apology. The solution proposed by certain medieval thinkers involved the concept of incubi and succubi, demonic beings capable of assuming physical forms sufficiently corporeal to engage in sexual activity with human partners while lacking the creative capacity to generate offspring from their own spiritual substance. The demonic beings who appeared in incubus form could, according to this theoretical framework, obtain human semen from male partners with whom they engaged while appearing as succubi, and subsequently transfer this semen to female partners with whom they engaged while appearing as incubi, thereby facilitating reproduction between human beings while creating the appearance of supernatural parentage for the offspring produced through such intermediation. This elaborate theoretical construction, which found its most influential exposition in the writings of Thomas Aquinas, allowed medieval theologians to maintain the Augustinian rejection of direct angelic reproduction, while preserving the possibility of demonic involvement in human generation and providing an explanatory framework for traditions concerning supernatural parentage that could not be entirely dismissed given their scriptural attestation. The early modern period witnessed significant developments in the interpretation of Nephilim traditions as the humanist recovery of ancient texts brought previously obscure sources into wider circulation, and as the Protestant Reformation generated new approaches to biblical interpretation that sometimes revived readings the medieval Catholic tradition had marginalized. The publication of the Ethiopic text of 1st Enoch in Europe during the 18th century, following its rediscovery by the Scottish explorer James Bruce among the manuscripts of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, made available for scholarly analysis a text that had been known in the West primarily through fragments preserved in patristic quotations, and through the Byzantine chronographic tradition that had incorporated Enochic material without preserving the complete text. The availability of the complete Book of the Watchers allowed European scholars to recognize the extent to which New Testament references to fallen angels and their punishment depended upon traditions that had been more fully developed in the Enochic literature than in the canonical Hebrew scriptures, raising questions about the relationship between canonical and extra-canonical texts that would continue to occupy biblical scholarship through subsequent centuries. The discovery of additional manuscripts of 1st Enoch and the related Enochic literature among the Dead Sea Scrolls during the 20th century confirmed the antiquity and importance of these traditions within Second Temple Judaism, demonstrating that the Book of the Watchers had been composed and circulating centuries before the emergence of Christianity, and that its elaborate angelology and demonology represented mainstream rather than marginal elements of Jewish religious thought during the period when the Hebrew canon was being defined. The scholarly reconstruction of the Nephilim tradition's development across the centuries of their textual attestation has revealed patterns of interpretation and reinterpretation that illuminate the processes by which religious communities adapt inherited materials to serve the theological and social needs of changing circumstances. The earliest recoverable form of the tradition, as represented in the Genesis 6 passage and its possible antecedents in Near Eastern mythology, appears to have explained the existence of the Nephilim as the offspring of divine beings and human women without extensive elaboration of the circumstances or consequences of these unions, beyond their contribution to the corruption that precipitated the flood. The elaboration of this basic narrative in the Book of the Watchers transformed a brief etiological note into an extensive account of cosmic transgression and its consequences, identifying specific angels, specifying their teachings, describing the violence of their offspring, and narrating the divine response that included both the destruction of the Nephilim and the punishment of their angelic fathers. The subsequent development of these traditions within the broader Enochic corpus and in related texts such as Jubilees and the Genesis Apocryphon produced increasingly detailed accounts of the antediluvian period and the various supernatural and semi-supernatural beings whose activities during that period established conditions that would continue to affect human existence throughout subsequent history. The identification of the Nephilim's disembodied spirits with the demons whose malevolent activities plagued humanity in the present age represented a particularly significant development within this tradition, providing an origin story for demonic beings that connected their existence to the specific historical circumstances of the antediluvian period, while explaining their intermediate status between the fully celestial angels and the fully terrestrial humans. The demons who emerged from the destruction of the Nephilim's bodies possessed the supernatural capacities deriving from their angelic parentage, while lacking the full spiritual nature that would have allowed them existence independent of the terrestrial realm, making them beings whose continued attachment to the earth required them to obtain sustenance through parasitic relationships with living beings, whether through possession, through the consumption of offerings, or through the feeding upon the life force of creatures they could influence or destroy. This demonology, which received its most elaborate development in texts such as the Testament of Solomon and the various magical papyri that preserve Jewish, Christian, and syncretic traditions concerning demonic beings and their manipulation, drew upon the Nephilim traditions to explain both the existence of demons and the techniques by which they could be controlled, since beings whose origin lay in specific historical circumstances could be constrained through knowledge of their names, their genealogies, and the events that had determined their current condition. The apocalyptic significance of the Nephilim traditions extended beyond the explanation of present demonic activity to encompass expectations concerning the eschatological period, when the judgments begun in the antediluvian era would reach their completion. The binding of the Watchers described in 1st Enoch, which confined them in darkness until the day of their final judgment, presupposed a temporal structure in which the antediluvian punishments represented preliminary rather than final dispositions of the angelic transgressors, dispositions that would give way to more definitive judgments when the cosmic order established after the flood itself came to its appointed end. The demons produced by the death of the Nephilim remained active throughout the present age precisely because their final judgment had been deferred until the eschatological culmination, when all beings, whether celestial, terrestrial, or intermediate, would receive their ultimate reward or punishment according to their response to divine authority. The Christian appropriation of these traditions, evident in the New Testament references to imprisoned spirits and angels kept in chains until judgment, incorporated the Enochic temporal framework into Christian eschatology, understanding the present age as a period during which preliminary judgments had been executed, but during which the full consequences of angelic rebellion remained to be manifested in the events surrounding Christ's return and the establishment of the eternal order that would follow the destruction of the present cosmic dispensation. The cultural persistence of Nephilim traditions across the boundaries separating ancient from medieval, medieval from early modern, and early modern from contemporary religious thought, demonstrates the capacity of these narratives to serve interpretive functions that transcend the specific historical circumstances within which they originated. The same essential story concerning supernatural beings who transgress boundaries, established by divine authority, who produce offspring characterized by violence and corruption, and who thereby contribute to the degradation of creation, requiring divine intervention for restoration, has been adapted to serve the theological, cosmological, and social needs of communities separated by centuries and by profound differences in their broader intellectual frameworks. The fundamental appeal of the narrative appears to reside in its capacity to explain the presence of evil within a creation established by a good deity, to locate the origin of this evil in choices made by beings other than the supreme God, while preserving the ultimate subordination of these rebellious beings to divine authority, and to anticipate a resolution that will restore the created order to its intended condition through the judgment and elimination of all beings who have contributed to its corruption. The modern scholarly analysis of the Nephilim traditions has proceeded along multiple disciplinary lines that have sometimes reinforced and sometimes challenged the interpretive frameworks inherited from earlier periods of religious thought. The comparative study of ancient Near Eastern mythology has identified potential parallels to the divine human unions and semi-divine offspring that characterize the Genesis 6 passage and its elaborations, suggesting that the Israelite traditions may have drawn upon or responded to Mesopotamian, Canaanite, or other regional narratives concerning the interactions between celestial and terrestrial realms during the earliest periods of cosmic and human history. The Mesopotamian traditions concerning the Apkallu, the wise sages who brought civilization to humanity before the flood, have been proposed as analogues or antecedents to the Watcher tradition, with the ambiguity concerning the Apkallu's ultimate evaluation in Mesopotamian thought perhaps contributing to the Israelite transformation of civilizing figures into corrupting transgressors whose gifts represented forbidden knowledge rather than beneficial instruction. The Greek traditions concerning the Titans and the giants who warred against the Olympian gods, while differing significantly in narrative detail from the biblical and Enochic accounts, share the fundamental structure of a conflict between an earlier generation of divine or semi-divine beings and the divine powers who ultimately establish order over the cosmos, suggesting that such narratives address concerns common to multiple ancient cultures regarding the nature of divine authority and the processes by which the present cosmic order was established against alternative possibilities. The archaeological and anthropological dimensions of modern Nephilim studies have shifted attention from the textual traditions to the question of what, if any, historical realities might have contributed to the development of these traditions within ancient Israelite culture. The discovery of populations characterized by unusual physical stature or by cultural practices significantly different from those of surrounding peoples could have contributed to traditions concerning giants or other anomalous beings whose existence required explanation within the framework of Israelite cosmology and history. The inhabitants of regions conquered during the settlement of Canaan may have been characterized by their Israelite conquerors as giants to emphasize the magnitude of the divine assistance required for their defeat and to legitimize the displacement of prior populations from territories now claimed as part of the divine inheritance granted to Israel. The persistence of giant traditions in relation to specific geographical locations such as the Bashan, associated with Og, and the Hebron, associated with the Anakim, suggests that these traditions may preserve memories of actual encounters with populations whose characteristics, whether physical, cultural, or both, marked them as distinct from the Israelite communities who eventually dominated these regions. The contemporary reception of Nephilim traditions within religious communities that maintain active engagement with biblical and parabiblical texts demonstrates the continuing vitality of these narratives as frameworks for understanding human existence within a cosmic context characterized by supernatural agency and by ongoing conflicts between divine and demonic powers. The evangelical and charismatic Christian communities that have developed extensive teachings concerning spiritual warfare frequently incorporate elements derived from the Nephilim traditions, understanding demonic beings as the spiritual residue of the antediluvian giants, and understanding the Christian struggle against such beings as participation in conflicts that began before the flood and will continue until the eschatological resolution anticipated in biblical prophecy. The specific techniques of spiritual warfare developed within these communities often draw upon the magical and demonological traditions that themselves derived from the Enochic literature, even when the practitioners of such techniques are unaware of the historical genealogy, connecting their practices to the Second Temple Jewish texts that first systematized knowledge concerning demonic beings and the methods by which they could be identified, constrained, and expelled. The relationship between the Nephilim traditions and contemporary alternative history movements represents a particularly significant dimension of the modern reception of these ancient narratives, as communities interested in alternative explanations for human origins and ancient civilizations have found in the Nephilim traditions resources for constructing comprehensive accounts of prehistory that challenge mainstream archaeological and anthropological narratives. The identification of the Nephilim with the founders of ancient civilizations whose technological and architectural achievements seem to exceed the capacities attributed to their populations by conventional scholarship has provided a framework within which the pyramids of Egypt, the megalithic structures of various global locations, and the advanced astronomical and mathematical knowledge attested in ancient texts can be explained as the legacy of beings whose supernatural parentage granted them capacities unavailable to ordinary humanity. The connection between the Nephilim traditions and theories concerning ancient astronauts, extraterrestrial intervention in human evolution, and the recovery of suppressed knowledge concerning human origins has generated interpretive frameworks that read the Genesis 6 passage and its elaborations as encoded descriptions of actual events involving beings from other worlds whose genetic experimentation produced hybrid populations whose artifacts and descendants continue to shape human civilization. The appeal of such interpretations lies partially in their capacity to integrate the authority of biblical tradition with the sense of wonder generated by contemplation of ancient achievements that seem to exceed ordinary human capacities, allowing those who accept such interpretations to maintain reverence for scriptural texts, while rejecting the interpretive frameworks that mainstream religious authorities have applied to those texts. The relationship between ancient textual traditions and contemporary interpretive communities reveals the remarkable plasticity of mythological narratives in adapting to the conceptual frameworks and existential concerns of successive generations, while maintaining continuity with the core images and questions that originally generated those narratives in their earliest forms. The Nephilim traditions have demonstrated particular resilience in this regard. Their ambiguity concerning the precise nature of the beings, described in Genesis 6, and the elaborate traditions that developed around that foundational text, providing sufficient interpretive space for communities with radically different cosmological assumptions to discover within these ancient narratives resources for addressing their own distinctive questions about human nature, cosmic structure, and the relationship between visible and invisible dimensions of reality. The scientific frameworks that emerged from the European Enlightenment and that came to dominate academic discourse concerning human origins and ancient history during the 19th and 20th centuries did not eliminate interest in the Nephilim traditions, but rather transformed the context within which those traditions were received and the questions that interpreters brought to their engagement with these ancient texts. The development of archaeology as a systematic discipline, with its emphasis on material evidence and its skepticism concerning claims that could not be verified through the recovery and analysis of physical artifacts, created pressures on religious communities to demonstrate the historical accuracy of biblical narratives through the recovery of archaeological evidence supporting the events described in scriptural texts. The search for physical evidence of the Nephilim and other biblical giants became a component of this broader project of archaeological apologetics, with reports of giant skeletal remains discovered in various locations around the world being interpreted as confirmation of the historical accuracy of the biblical accounts and as vindication of traditional beliefs against the skepticism of secular scholarship. The history of alleged giant discoveries reveals both the intensity of the desire to recover physical evidence for beings described in ancient texts and the challenges that have attended efforts to verify such discoveries through the rigorous methods demanded by contemporary archaeological practice. Reports of giant bones and skeletons have circulated throughout the modern period, with newspapers, books, and more recently internet platforms disseminating accounts of remarkable discoveries that seem to confirm the existence of populations characterized by extraordinary physical dimensions during various periods of ancient and prehistoric history. The Smithsonian Institution has been particularly prominent in narratives concerning the suppression of evidence for ancient giants, with claims that the institution systematically collected and then destroyed or concealed giant skeletal remains to protect the dominant paradigms of human evolution against evidence that would require fundamental revision of established scientific frameworks. The appeal of such suppression narratives lies in their capacity to explain the absence of verified giant remains in museum collections and peer-reviewed scientific literature, while maintaining confidence in the reality of discoveries that eyewitness accounts and historical reports seem to attest. The structure of suppression narratives places those who accept the reality of ancient giants in opposition to institutional authorities whose commitment to established paradigms blinds them to evidence that challenges those paradigms, positioning the seekers after alternative knowledge as courageous truth seekers, struggling against the closed-mindedness of academic and governmental establishments. The actual history of alleged giant discoveries reveals patterns more complex than either simple acceptance or institutional suppression, with many reported discoveries proving upon investigation to be misidentified, remains of prehistoric animals whose large bones were interpreted as evidence for giant humans by observers unfamiliar with the skeletal anatomy of mammoths, mastodons, and other megafauna whose remains are scattered throughout geological deposits across multiple continents. The connection between giant traditions and the interpretation of megafauna remains appears to have deep historical roots extending well beyond the modern period of alleged discoveries and institutional suppression. Ancient Greek and Roman authors recorded traditions concerning the discovery of enormous bones that were interpreted as the remains of heroes and giants from the mythological past, with such discoveries sometimes becoming objects of religious veneration and civic pride for the communities in whose territories they were found. The bones of the hero Orestes were reportedly recovered and transported to Sparta, where they became objects of cultic significance, while the bones of various other heroes and giants were displayed at temples and civic buildings throughout the ancient Mediterranean world as material evidence for the reality of the beings celebrated in mythological tradition. Modern paleontological analysis suggests that many of these ancient giant discoveries were actually the remains of extinct megafauna, with the fossil deposits of the Mediterranean region providing abundant materials for interpretation as evidence of ancient giants by observers whose anatomical knowledge did not extend to species that had disappeared thousands of years before the development of human civilization in those regions. The interpretation of megafauna remains as giant human bones demonstrates the powerful influence that cultural expectations exert on the perception and classification of physical evidence, with observers finding confirmation for traditional beliefs about ancient giants in materials that contemporary scientific analysis assigns to entirely different categories of being. The persistence of this pattern of interpretation into the modern period, despite the development of comparative anatomy and paleontology as systematic scientific disciplines, reveals the continuing appeal of frameworks that connect material discoveries with narratives of cosmic significance concerning the nature and history of human existence. The interpretation of ancient megalithic structures as evidence for giant populations represents another dimension of the contemporary engagement with Nephilim traditions, with the enormous scale of monuments such as the Egyptian pyramids, the walls of Baalbek in Lebanon, the stone platforms of Puma Punku in Bolivia, and various other ancient constructions being cited as evidence that their builders possessed capabilities exceeding those of ordinary humans. The massive stones employed in these constructions, some weighing hundreds of tons and positioned with precision that seems to challenge explanation through conventional engineering methods, have generated extensive speculation concerning the nature of the builders who accomplished such remarkable feats of construction and the methods they employed in doing so. The Nephilim traditions provide one framework within which such constructions can be explained, with the supernatural strength and knowledge inherited from angelic fathers, enabling the giant offspring to accomplish architectural achievements that would have been impossible for purely human populations lacking access to supernatural capacities. The alternative explanation that such constructions represent evidence for lost technologies developed by advanced prehistoric civilizations whose subsequent destruction erased knowledge of their methods provides a naturalistic variant of the same basic intuition, namely that conventional historical and archaeological frameworks fail to account for the actual achievements attested by the material remains of ancient civilizations. The integration of Nephilim traditions with theories of lost ancient technologies has generated hybrid interpretive frameworks that understand the giants described in biblical and parabiblical texts as the possessors or transmitters of advanced knowledge whose technological applications produce the remarkable constructions that ancient sites continue to display to contemporary observers. The relationship between the Nephilim traditions and the Anunnaki of Sumerian and Akkadian mythology represents one of the most significant developments in contemporary alternative history, with interpreters finding connections between the biblical accounts of divine human hybridization and the Mesopotamian traditions concerning the gods who created and governed human civilization in the earliest periods of recorded history. The cuneiform texts recovered from archaeological sites throughout Mesopotamia during the 19th and 20th centuries revealed mythological traditions concerning divine beings whose activities shaped the cosmos and established the conditions within which human existence became possible, with the Anunnaki appearing in these traditions as a collective designation for the great gods who determined the fates of heaven, earth, and the underworld. The interpretation of the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial beings whose intervention in human evolution produced the distinctive characteristics of Homo sapiens was developed most influentially by Zecharia Sitchin, whose book The 12th Planet, published in 1976, proposed that the Anunnaki were astronauts from a planet called Nibiru, whose genetic engineering of proto-humans created the slave species that eventually developed into modern humanity. Sitchin's interpretations of cuneiform texts, while rejected by academic specialists in Assyriology and Sumerian studies, have proven enormously influential within alternative history communities, generating interpretive frameworks that read ancient mythological traditions as encoded descriptions of actual historical events involving technologically advanced beings from other worlds. The connection between Sitchin's theories concerning the Anunnaki and the biblical traditions concerning the Nephilim was developed by Sitchin himself and by subsequent authors who have found in the combination of Mesopotamian and biblical traditions resources for constructing comprehensive accounts of human origins that integrate evidence from multiple ancient textual corpora. The integration of Nephilim traditions with Anunnaki theories has generated interpretive frameworks that understand the fallen angels of the biblical and Enochic traditions as descriptions of the same beings that Mesopotamian traditions knew as the Anunnaki, with the different cultural contexts producing different narrative framings of essentially the same historical events and cosmic relationships. Within these frameworks, the descent of the Watchers, described in 1st Enoch, corresponds to the arrival of the Anunnaki on Earth. Their sexual union with human women corresponds to the genetic engineering programs through which the Anunnaki modified proto-human populations, and the Nephilim themselves correspond to the hybrid products of these engineering programs, whose characteristics differed from those of the original human stock. The flood narrative that in both biblical and Mesopotamian traditions destroys most of terrestrial life becomes within these interpretive frameworks an attempt by the Anunnaki leadership to eliminate the hybrid populations that had been produced through the actions of subordinate members of their species, with the preservation of Noah and his family representing the survival of a lineage deemed acceptable by the extraterrestrial authorities who are determined to cleanse the earth of the products of unauthorized genetic experimentation. The continuation of giant traditions in the post-flood biblical narratives, with populations such as the Anakim and Rephaim preserving characteristics derived from the antediluvian hybridization, becomes evidence that the flood failed to completely eliminate the hybrid lineages, and that descendants of the Nephilim continued to influence human affairs throughout the historical period, documented in biblical and other ancient texts. The appeal of such integrated frameworks lies partially in their capacity to synthesize materials from multiple ancient textual traditions into unified accounts that seem to reveal hidden patterns connecting apparently diverse mythological systems, while also providing explanations for phenomena that seem anomalous within conventional historical and archaeological frameworks. The monuments of ancient civilizations, the sophisticated astronomical and mathematical knowledge attested in ancient texts, the persistent traditions concerning gods who walked among humans in the earliest periods of history, and the various mythological accounts of divine human hybridization all find coherent explanation within frameworks that understand ancient mythological traditions as preserving memories of actual historical events involving technologically advanced beings whose activities shaped the development of human civilization. The emotional appeal of such frameworks encompasses both the wonder generated by contemplation of cosmic connections that link human existence with beings and events of interplanetary or even intergalactic scope, and the satisfaction of possessing knowledge that mainstream authorities either cannot access or actively suppress in defense of paradigms whose inadequacy becomes increasingly apparent as alternative researchers uncover evidence that established institutions refuse to acknowledge or incorporate into their frameworks. The critical evaluation of connections proposed between the Nephilim traditions and the Anunnaki mythology requires careful attention to the actual content of the relevant textual sources, and to the linguistic and philological methods through which those sources have been analysed by scholars working within the academic traditions that govern the study of ancient Near Eastern languages and literatures. The Sumerian and Akkadian texts that mention the Anunnaki present these beings as divine figures within the standard polytheistic framework of Mesopotamian religion, with their activities, relationships, and characteristics conforming to patterns attested throughout the mythological traditions of ancient Mesopotamia rather than suggesting contact with extraterrestrial beings or involvement with genetic engineering of human populations. The creation myths preserved in Sumerian and Akkadian texts describe the creation of humans through various means, including the shaping of clay and the animation of that clay through divine breath or blood, without suggesting the kind of hybridization between divine and human beings that characterizes the Nephilim traditions of biblical and Jewish literature. The linguistic arguments through which interpreters such as Sitchin have connected Sumerian terminology with references to space travel, genetic engineering, and extraterrestrial origins have been comprehensively rejected by specialists in Sumerian and Akkadian languages, who have demonstrated that Sitchin's readings of cuneiform texts consistently violate the grammatical and semantic constraints that govern proper interpretation of these ancient languages. The academic critique of alternative interpretations does not, of course, resolve the questions that generate interest in such interpretations, as those who find the alternative frameworks compelling frequently understand academic criticism as evidence of the defensive posture adopted by institutional authorities whose commitment to establish paradigms renders them incapable of recognizing evidence that challenges those paradigms. The persistence of interest in connections between the Nephilim traditions and various alternative historical frameworks, despite academic criticism, reflects the deeper existential and religious questions that drive engagement with these ancient narratives and their contemporary reinterpretations. The question of human origins, of the nature and source of human capacities that seem to distinguish the human species from other terrestrial life forms, and of the relationship between human existence and whatever powers or principles govern the broader cosmos, remains a fundamental concern for human beings across diverse cultural and historical contexts. The ancient narratives concerning divine human hybridization address these questions within the cosmological frameworks available to their original authors and audiences, providing accounts of human nature and history that integrated human existence within cosmic structures characterized by the agency of supernatural beings whose activities shape the conditions of earthly life. The persistence of these narratives and the continuing efforts to interpret them in relation to contemporary knowledge about the cosmos and human evolution demonstrate the enduring significance of the questions that originally generated mythological reflection on these themes. The contemporary interpretations that connect the Nephilim with extraterrestrial beings represent attempts to address the same fundamental questions within frameworks that incorporate contemporary scientific understanding concerning the scale and structure of the cosmos, while maintaining the sense of cosmic significance and supernatural involvement in human affairs that characterizes traditional religious and mythological frameworks. The relationship between the Nephilim traditions and questions of evil, suffering, and moral corruption in human existence represents another dimension of these narratives that has continued to resonate across diverse historical and cultural contexts. The Enochic traditions that developed the Genesis 6 passage into comprehensive accounts of the origins of evil attributed to the Watchers and their offspring responsibility for the corruption of human civilization through the teaching of forbidden knowledge and the introduction of violence and moral transgression into human society. The appeal of this explanatory framework lies in its capacity to account for the pervasive presence of evil and suffering in human existence through reference to supernatural agents whose actions corrupted an originally good creation, thereby absolving humanity itself of ultimate responsibility for the evils that characterize human history, while providing hope that the elimination or defeat of these supernatural agents might restore the original goodness that characterized creation before its corruption. The connection between the Nephilim traditions and contemporary Christian teachings concerning spiritual warfare extends this ancient framework into contexts where believers understand themselves as participating in ongoing cosmic conflicts between divine and demonic forces whose outcome will determine the ultimate fate of human souls and of the created order as a whole. The techniques of spiritual warfare developed within evangelical and charismatic Christian communities frequently incorporate elements derived from the demonological traditions that themselves developed from the Enochic literature, even when practitioners are unaware of the historical connections between their practices and the Second Temple, Jewish texts that first systematized knowledge concerning demonic beings and the methods appropriate for combating them. The eschatological dimensions of the Nephilim traditions have proven particularly significant for contemporary religious communities whose interpretive frameworks emphasize the approaching end of the present age and the imminent return of conditions that characterize the antediluvian period. The statement attributed to Jesus in Matthew 24:37-39 that the conditions preceding his return would resemble those that prevailed in the days of Noah has been interpreted by some contemporary readers as suggesting that the same kinds of supernatural transgression that characterize the antediluvian period, specifically the union of divine or angelic beings with human women and the production of hybrid offspring, would recur in the period immediately preceding the eschatological consummation. This interpretive framework has generated extensive speculation concerning the nature of the beings whose return or renewed activity would characterize the end times, with some interpreters understanding reports of extraterrestrial contact, alien abduction experiences, and various paranormal phenomena as evidence that the same beings whose activities corrupted the antediluvian world have resumed their operations in preparation for the final conflict anticipated in biblical prophecy. The integration of UFO phenomena with Nephilim traditions has produced interpretive frameworks in which the apparent extraterrestrial beings reported in abduction accounts and UFO sightings are understood as manifestations of the same angelic or demonic beings whose activities are described in Genesis 6 and its elaborations, with their current activities representing preparation for the eschatological events that will mark the culmination of human history. The frameworks that identify UFO phenomena with the return of antediluvian conditions represent a significant development in the ongoing interpretation of the Nephilim traditions, extending the explanatory scope of these ancient narratives to encompass categories of contemporary experience that would seem, at first consideration, entirely disconnected from the theological and mythological context in which the original traditions developed. The interpreters who have developed these connections have produced extensive bodies of literature that combine biblical exegesis with analysis of ufological reports, creating synthetic interpretive systems that address both the meaning of ancient texts and the significance of modern phenomena within unified explanatory frameworks. These interpretive systems have found receptive audiences among communities already predisposed to understand contemporary events as manifestations of prophetically anticipated eschatological developments, providing frameworks that integrate unusual or anomalous experiences into coherent theological narratives, while simultaneously offering explanations for the persistence and seeming reality of phenomena that resist conventional scientific explanation. The appeal of these interpretive frameworks lies partly in their capacity to address categories of experience that mainstream religious institutions often ignore or dismiss while maintaining connection with biblical authority and traditional Christian belief systems, creating spaces where experiential claims that might otherwise be marginalized can receive serious attention and theological interpretation. The historical development of these integrative frameworks reflects broader patterns of religious adaptation to changing cultural contexts in which traditional theological categories must be extended or reinterpreted to address phenomena and questions that were not anticipated within the original context of their formulation. The emergence of widespread reports of unidentified aerial phenomena in the decades following the Second World War created categories of experience that demanded interpretation within both secular and religious frameworks, with secular interpreters generally favouring hypotheses involving extraterrestrial visitation from technologically advanced civilizations elsewhere in the cosmos, while religious interpreters frequently sought explanations that maintain connection with established theological categories concerning angelic, demonic, or other supernatural beings. The interpreters who identified UFO phenomena with demonic manifestations were extending interpretive strategies that had previously been applied to other categories of anomalous experience, including spiritualist phenomena, poltergeist activity, and various forms of alleged supernatural occurrence, thereby maintaining the explanatory comprehensiveness of traditional demonological frameworks while addressing new categories of reported experience. The specific connection with the Nephilim traditions provided additional resources for these interpretive efforts, offering narratives concerning the physical embodiment of supernatural beings and their capacity to produce hybrid offspring that seemed particularly relevant to abduction accounts involving alleged breeding programs and the production of hybrid entities. The theological sophistication of these interpretive efforts varies considerably, ranging from crude associations that simply identify reported extraterrestrial beings with biblical demons to elaborate systematic treatments that integrate extensive biblical exegesis with detailed analysis of contemporary phenomena within comprehensive theological frameworks. The academic study of these contemporary interpretive developments represents a relatively recent extension of scholarship on the Nephilim traditions, moving beyond the historical and textual analysis that has characterized most scholarly engagement with these materials to examine their continuing significance in contemporary religious life and their role in shaping responses to categories of experience that fall outside conventional religious and scientific frameworks. The scholars who have undertaken this work have documented the emergence of what might be termed a contemporary mythological complex that combines elements of ancient Near Eastern cosmology, Second Temple Jewish angelology, Christian eschatology, and modern ufology into synthetic systems that address questions of cosmic significance and human destiny within frameworks that maintain connection with traditional religious authority while incorporating contemporary categories of knowledge and experience. The popularity of these synthetic interpretive systems among certain religious communities demonstrates the continuing vitality of the questions that originally generated mythological reflection on the nature of cosmic beings and their interactions with humanity, even as the specific forms in which these questions are addressed reflect the distinctive concerns and knowledge frameworks of contemporary culture. The relationship between scholarly interpretation and popular reception of the Nephilim traditions represents a dimension of these materials that illuminates broader patterns in the circulation and transformation of ideas across different social and cultural contexts. The academic scholarship that has contributed to contemporary understanding of the Nephilim traditions has been produced within institutional contexts characterized by methodological commitments to historical criticism, philological analysis, and comparative study that are substantially different from the contexts in which popular interpretations of these traditions develop and circulate. The movement of ideas between these different contexts involves processes of translation, simplification, and recontextualization that transform the significance and function of scholarly findings as they enter popular discourse, often extracting particular claims or interpretations from the methodological frameworks within which they were originally developed, and integrating them into synthetic systems, organized according to different principles and serving different purposes. The scholarly establishment of connections between the Genesis 6 passage and wider ancient Near Eastern traditions concerning divine-human interaction, for example, has been incorporated into popular interpretive frameworks in ways that often extend these connections far beyond what the original scholarly analysis would support, generating claims about unified ancient knowledge of extraterrestrial beings or prehistoric high civilizations that derive superficial legitimacy from scholarly findings, while departing substantially from the conclusions that scholars themselves would draw from the same evidence. The dynamics of contemporary media environments have amplified and accelerated these processes of translation and transformation, enabling the rapid circulation of interpretive claims across vast audiences, while simultaneously fragmenting the context within which these claims are evaluated and assessed. The digital platforms that now serve as primary venues for the dissemination of alternative historical and religious interpretations facilitate the construction of interpretive communities organized around shared commitments to particular explanatory frameworks, creating contexts in which claims that would be subject to critical scrutiny within academic or mainstream religious institutions can circulate largely unchallenged among audiences already predisposed to accept their fundamental premises. The algorithmic organization of content distribution on these platforms tends to reinforce existing interpretive commitments by directing users toward content consistent with their demonstrated interests, creating feedback loops that can insulate alternative interpretive communities from engagement with perspectives that might challenge their foundational assumptions. These dynamics have contributed to the proliferation of increasingly elaborate interpretive systems concerning the Nephilim and related topics, as creators compete for audience attention by offering ever more comprehensive and dramatic versions of the underlying narratives, generating content that pushes the boundaries of interpretive speculation, while remaining connected to the biblical and mythological sources that provide these traditions with their authority and appeal. The economic dimensions of contemporary alternative historical and religious content creation have also shaped the development of interpretive frameworks concerning the Nephilim traditions, as the monetization structures of digital platforms create incentives for the production of content that generates sustained audience engagement rather than content that addresses questions with the precision and qualification characteristic of academic scholarship. The extended treatment that complex topics like the Nephilim traditions receive in popular media reflects both genuine audience interest in comprehensive exploration of these materials and the economic realities of content production environments where longer content generates greater revenue through advertising or subscription mechanisms. These economic incentives align with genuine audience demand for substantive engagement with questions of cosmic and spiritual significance, creating markets for content that combines entertainment value with apparent depth of analysis, even when the analytical frameworks employed would not withstand critical scrutiny from within academic or traditional religious contexts. The creators who have developed successful platforms for the dissemination of alternative interpretations of the Nephilim traditions have typically combined genuine engagement with primary sources and scholarly literature with interpretive approaches that extend conclusions far beyond what the evidence would support under more rigorous methodological standards, producing content that maintains surface plausibility while serving audiences whose primary interests lie in the validation of previously held beliefs or the satisfaction of desires for access to hidden or suppressed knowledge. The psychological dimensions of engagement with the Nephilim traditions represent another area that has received attention from scholars interested in understanding the contemporary significance of these ancient materials. The appeal of narratives concerning supernatural beings and their interactions with humanity reflects fundamental patterns of human cognition and social organization that have been explored through various theoretical frameworks within psychology, anthropology, and cognitive science. The tendency to attribute agency and intention to phenomena that might alternatively be explained through impersonal causation represents a cognitive pattern that has been documented across diverse cultural contexts and that appears to have deep roots in human psychological architecture, potentially explaining the persistence of beliefs in supernatural beings across the full range of human societies, regardless of their specific cultural or technological characteristics. The Nephilim traditions provide frameworks for the expression of these cognitive tendencies within contexts that maintain connection with authoritative religious traditions, offering believers opportunities to experience and interpret anomalous phenomena through lenses that integrate personal experience with cosmic significance and divine purpose. The emotional resonance of these narratives derives partly from their capacity to address feelings of cosmic significance and connection with larger purposes that modern secular frameworks often fail to satisfy, providing adherents with senses of meaning and purpose that transcend the mundane concerns of ordinary existence, while maintaining connection with communities of interpretation that validate and reinforce these experiences. The therapeutic and transformative dimensions of engagement with the Nephilim traditions have received particular attention from scholars examining the role of these materials in contemporary religious practice. The identification of personal difficulties, psychological struggles, or life challenges with the influence of demonic forces derived from the Nephilim traditions can provide believers with explanatory frameworks that externalize responsibility for negative experiences, while simultaneously providing means for addressing these experiences through spiritual practices understood to be effective against supernatural adversaries. The practices of spiritual warfare, deliverance ministry, and generational curse breaking that have developed within various Christian communities frequently incorporate concepts and techniques ultimately derived from the demonological traditions that themselves trace their origins to the Enochic elaborations of the Genesis 6 passage, even when practitioners are unaware of these historical connections. The effectiveness of these practices, from the perspective of participants, depends not on the historical accuracy of their theoretical foundations, but on their capacity to provide meaningful frameworks for the interpretation and transformation of lived experience, offering hope and agency to individuals who understand themselves as participants in cosmic conflicts, whose outcomes have significance extending far beyond their individual circumstances. The intergenerational transmission of engagement with the Nephilim traditions represents another dimension of these materials that scholars have begun to examine. The patterns through which beliefs, practices, and interpretive frameworks concerning the Nephilim are transmitted across generations reflect broader dynamics of religious socialization while also exhibiting distinctive features related to the marginal or alternative status of these traditions within mainstream religious institutions. The children raised in families or communities where the Nephilim traditions occupy significant positions in religious understanding develop relationships with these materials through processes of immersion and participation that differ substantially from the processes through which adults may come to engage with these traditions through personal study or conversion experiences. The identity formation processes through which young people, raised within these interpretive communities, develop their own relationships with the traditions they have inherited, involve complex negotiations between received frameworks and the alternative interpretations available within wider cultural contexts, potentially resulting in either deeper commitment to received traditions or rejection of interpretive frameworks that come to seem implausible when exposed to critical perspectives available outside the communities of their upbringing. The study of these intergenerational dynamics provides insight into the mechanisms through which alternative interpretive traditions maintain themselves across time, adapting to changing cultural contexts while preserving core commitments that distinguish them from mainstream alternatives. The visual and material culture associated with contemporary engagement with the Nephilim traditions represents a dimension of these materials that has received increasing scholarly attention, as researchers have recognized the significance of non-textual modes of engagement with religious and mythological content. The imagery associated with the Nephilim in contemporary popular culture draws upon multiple sources, combining elements derived from traditional religious iconography with influences from fantasy art, science fiction, and horror genres to produce distinctive visual vocabularies that shape how audiences imagine and conceptualize these beings. The towering humanoid figures with exaggerated physical features that commonly represent the Nephilim in contemporary visual media reflect interpretive emphasis on their status as giants and hybrids, while incorporating aesthetic elements that mark these beings as both human and other, familiar and strange. The circulation of these images through digital platforms has contributed to the standardization of certain visual conventions across diverse interpretive communities, creating shared visual vocabularies that facilitate recognition and communication even among audiences who may differ substantially in their specific theological interpretations of the Nephilim traditions. The material culture associated with the Nephilim traditions extends beyond digital imagery to include physical artifacts including books, artwork, jewellery, and other objects that serve as markers of identity and commitment for participants in interpretive communities organised around these traditions. The geographical dimensions of contemporary engagement with the Nephilim traditions reflect patterns of regional religious culture that have been shaped by historical factors including migration, evangelization, and the development of distinctive local or regional interpretive traditions. The evangelical and charismatic Christian communities within which the Nephilim traditions have found their most extensive contemporary elaboration are unevenly distributed across both North American and global contexts, creating patterns of regional concentration that influence the availability and accessibility of interpretive frameworks concerning these materials. The missionary activities of American evangelical organizations have contributed to the global dissemination of interpretive frameworks originally developed within American religious contexts, extending engagement with the Nephilim traditions into cultural settings where these materials may be integrated with local religious traditions and concerns in ways that produce distinctive regional variations on themes originally developed within Western interpretive contexts. The study of these processes of global dissemination and local adaptation provides insight into the dynamics through which religious ideas circulate across cultural boundaries, transforming and being transformed by the contexts into which they move, while maintaining connections with the textual and theological sources from which they derive their authority. The institutional dimensions of engagement with the Nephilim traditions reflect the marginal position these materials occupy within mainstream religious organizations and the consequent development of alternative institutional forms for the organization and dissemination of interpretive frameworks concerning them. The churches, ministries, conferences, publications, and digital platforms that serve communities engaged with the Nephilim traditions constitute a distinctive institutional ecology that operates substantially independently of mainstream religious organizations, while maintaining connections with broader evangelical and charismatic Christian networks. The leaders who have achieved prominence within these institutional contexts have typically developed their positions through demonstration of interpretive expertise and the capacity to attract and maintain audiences, rather than through the credentialing processes that govern advancement within mainstream religious organizations, creating leadership patterns that reward entrepreneurial capacity and charismatic appeal over formal theological education or institutional loyalty. The economic sustainability of these institutions depends on their capacity to generate and maintain audience engagement through content production and community building activities, creating incentive structures that may favour the development of increasingly elaborate and dramatic interpretive frameworks as leaders compete for audience attention within crowded media environments. The tension between institutional sustainability and interpretive restraint represents one of the fundamental dynamics shaping contemporary engagement with the Nephilim traditions, as content creators navigate between the demands of audience engagement and the constraints imposed by textual evidence and theological coherence. The elaboration of interpretive frameworks concerning the Nephilim beyond what the ancient sources directly support reflects not merely the creative imagination of individual interpreters, but the structural pressures created by media environments that reward novelty and dramatic content while punishing repetition and restraint. The observers who have tracked the evolution of Nephilim-related content across digital platforms have documented patterns of escalating claims and increasingly elaborate connections as creators seek to differentiate their offerings from competitors and maintain audience engagement over extended periods. The integration of the Nephilim traditions with conspiracy theories concerning contemporary events represents one manifestation of this dynamic, as interpreters have drawn connections between ancient narratives and modern phenomena including government programs, technological developments, and political events in ways that extend the relevance of these materials, while generating the novel content that digital platforms reward. The relationship between the Nephilim traditions and contemporary conspiracy culture reflects deeper patterns of epistemological orientation that characterize significant portions of contemporary religious and political discourse. The hermeneutic of suspicion that treats official or mainstream accounts as inherently unreliable while privileging alternative or suppressed information applies equally to biblical interpretation and contemporary political analysis, creating intellectual frameworks within which the recovery of hidden truths about the Nephilim and the exposure of concealed agendas in contemporary institutions appear as parallel manifestations of the same fundamental project. The communities that have formed around the Nephilim traditions often overlap substantially with communities organized around various conspiracy theories, sharing not merely specific claims, but underlying orientations toward knowledge, authority, and the relationship between appearance and reality. The appeal of the Nephilim traditions within these contexts derives partly from their capacity to provide cosmic and historical frameworks within which contemporary concerns about hidden powers and suppressed information find validation and explanation, connecting present anxieties with ancient narratives in ways that suggest both the perennial nature of these struggles and the ultimate triumph of truth over concealment. The eschatological dimensions of contemporary engagement with the Nephilim traditions have achieved particular prominence within interpretive frameworks that understand current events through the lens of biblical prophecy concerning the end times. The passages from the Gospels of Matthew and Luke that compare the conditions preceding the return of Christ to the days of Noah have been interpreted by many contemporary commentators as suggesting that phenomena parallel to those described in Genesis 6 will characterize the period immediately preceding eschatological consummation, the return of the Nephilim, or the manifestation of comparable hybrid beings through contemporary means including genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, or extraterrestrial contact features prominently in many contemporary interpretive frameworks as a marker of the nearness of eschatological events. These interpretations transform engagement with the Nephilim traditions from purely historical or mythological interest into urgent contemporary relevance, positioning those who understand these materials as possessing crucial knowledge about the unfolding of events that will culminate in the transformation of cosmic order. The relationship between the Nephilim traditions and contemporary discourse concerning transhumanism and human enhancement technologies reflects the capacity of ancient narratives to provide frameworks for interpreting novel phenomena that did not exist when these texts were originally composed. The prospect of human beings utilizing technological means to transcend the limitations of natural human embodiment through genetic engineering, cybernetic enhancement, or digital consciousness transfer has been interpreted by many contemporary commentators as parallel to the ancient transgression that produced the Nephilim, representing human attempts to achieve through technological means the transcendence of natural limitations that the original Watchers sought through supernatural intervention. The theological framework that interprets the original angelic transgression as rebellion against divinely established boundaries has been extended to encompass contemporary technological developments that challenge traditional understandings of human nature and its limits. The Nephilim traditions thus provide resources for theological critique of transhumanism and human enhancement technologies, positioning these developments within a cosmic narrative that warns against attempts to transcend the boundaries that divine wisdom has established for human existence. The science fiction dimensions of contemporary engagement with the Nephilim traditions reflect the permeability of boundaries between religious interpretation and imaginative speculation in contemporary cultural production. The hypothesis that the beings described as fallen angels in traditional biblical interpretation might be reinterpreted as extraterrestrial visitors whose advanced technology appeared supernatural to ancient observers has found expression in both religious interpretive frameworks and secular science fiction narratives. The ancient astronaut theories associated with authors including Erich von Däniken and Zechariah Sitchin provided templates for reinterpreting the Nephilim traditions within frameworks that substituted extraterrestrial for supernatural causation while preserving the basic narrative structure of non-human beings interacting with and influencing human development. The convergence between religious and science fiction interpretations of the Nephilim traditions illustrates the capacity of these materials to generate meaning across diverse interpretive frameworks, accommodating both traditional supernatural readings and naturalistic reinterpretations while maintaining engagement with the same textual sources and narrative elements. The literary and artistic productions that have drawn upon the Nephilim traditions represent a creative legacy that extends from ancient apocalyptic literature through medieval theological speculation to contemporary fiction, film, and visual art. The narrative possibilities inherent in the conjunction of human and divine or angelic nature have attracted creative exploration across historical periods and cultural contexts, generating imaginative works that explore themes of hybridity, transgression, and the boundaries between different orders of being. The contemporary fantasy and horror genres have proven particularly receptive to Nephilim-related themes, producing novels, films, television series, and games that draw upon these traditions while adapting them to the conventions and expectations of their respective media. The circulation of these creative works contributes to public awareness and interest in the Nephilim traditions, while shaping the interpretive frameworks through which audiences approach both the creative works and the ancient textual sources from which they ultimately derive. The academic study of the Nephilim traditions has undergone significant development over recent decades, as scholars have increasingly recognized the importance of these materials for understanding ancient religion, Second Temple Judaism, early Christianity, and contemporary religious movements. The publication of scholarly editions, translations, and commentaries on the Enochic literature and related texts has made these materials more accessible to both academic and popular audiences, while establishing frameworks for their interpretation that inform subsequent engagement across diverse contexts. The emergence of reception history as a recognized scholarly approach has directed attention to the ways in which ancient texts have been read, interpreted, and transformed across historical periods, providing frameworks for understanding the diverse interpretive traditions that have developed around the Nephilim materials. The interdisciplinary nature of contemporary scholarship on these traditions, drawing upon textual criticism, religious studies, anthropology, and cultural studies, reflects the complexity of phenomena that span ancient textual composition, theological interpretation, and contemporary cultural production. The persistence of engagement with the Nephilim traditions across the vast temporal span from their original composition to the present day raises fundamental questions about the nature of religious and mythological materials and their capacity to generate meaning across radically different historical and cultural contexts. The interpretive frameworks through which contemporary audiences approach these materials differ fundamentally from those that governed their original composition and ancient reception, yet something in these narratives continues to attract attention, provoke speculation, and inspire creative elaboration. The themes of transgression across cosmic boundaries, the generation of beings that exist between established categories, and the divine response to violations of established order address concerns that appear to possess enduring relevance across diverse cultural contexts, even as the specific forms through which these concerns are articulated vary dramatically across historical periods. The boundary transgression that lies at the heart of the Nephilim narrative addresses fundamental questions about the structure of reality and the consequences of violating the distinctions through which that structure is maintained. The angels who abandoned their proper dwelling to pursue union with human women crossed a boundary that divine wisdom had established to maintain the order of creation, and the consequences of that transgression extended beyond the individual violators to affect the entire created order. The Nephilim themselves embodied the violation of categorical boundaries, existing as beings that belonged fully to neither the angelic nor the human realm, their very existence representing a distortion of the created order that could not be allowed to persist. The flood that destroyed the ancient world served not merely as punishment for wickedness, but as cosmic reset, eliminating the hybrid beings whose existence violated the distinctions through which creation was properly ordered, while preserving through Noah and his family a remnant through which properly human life could continue. The theological implications of the Nephilim narrative have been drawn in diverse directions by interpreters across historical periods, serving variously to explain the origin of evil, to account for cultural achievements attributed to superhuman inspiration, to provide etiology for the demonic beings whose existence was assumed within ancient worldviews, and to establish precedents for understanding the relationship between human and divine or spiritual realms. The flexibility of the traditions in accommodating diverse theological applications reflects both the generative ambiguity of the original texts and the capacity of interpreters to emphasize different elements in accordance with their particular concerns and contexts. The giants who figure so prominently in many interpretations represent just one dimension of traditions that also encompass angelic rebellion, forbidden knowledge, demonic affliction, and cosmic judgment, any of which may assume primary importance within specific interpretive frameworks, while the others recede into secondary significance. The cultural work performed by the Nephilim traditions across historical periods has served diverse social and religious functions that extend beyond the literal content of the narratives themselves. The establishment of clear boundaries between human and non-human realms reinforces social orders that depend upon the maintenance of distinctions whose violation threatens established hierarchies and relationships. The punishment of transgressors who cross these boundaries validates the authority of those who maintain and enforce categorical distinctions, whether these transgressors are understood as angels who abandon their proper station, humans who exceeded their appropriate sphere, or hybrid beings whose very existence violated the structure of creation. The restoration of proper order through divine judgment provides assurance that violations of fundamental boundaries, however catastrophic their immediate consequences, cannot ultimately succeed against the power that establishes and maintains cosmic order. The contemporary relevance of these themes derives from the persistence of concerns about boundaries, transgression, and order in cultural contexts that differ dramatically from those within which the original texts were composed. The anxiety surrounding various forms of boundary crossing in contemporary society, whether between human and machine, natural and artificial, male and female, or human and posthuman, finds resonance with ancient narratives about beings who existed between established categories and the consequences of their existence for the order of creation. The Nephilim traditions provide symbolic resources for engaging with these contemporary anxieties, offering frameworks for understanding boundary transgression and its consequences that carry the authority of ancient religious texts, while remaining sufficiently flexible to accommodate diverse applications to contemporary phenomena. The trajectory of the Nephilim traditions from ancient composition through historical interpretation to contemporary elaboration traces the persistence and transformation of religious ideas across radically different contexts. The brief and enigmatic references in the received text of Genesis generated elaborate interpretive traditions in Second Temple Judaism that filled the gaps left by the biblical text with detailed narratives concerning angelic rebellion, forbidden knowledge, and divine judgment. These expanded traditions influenced early Christian understandings of the angelic world and its relationship to human affairs, shaping theological frameworks that would persist through subsequent centuries, even as the specific interpretive traditions that generated them receded from mainstream religious consciousness. The recovery of ancient texts and the development of new interpretive frameworks in modern and contemporary periods have renewed engagement with these traditions while transforming them in accordance with the concerns and assumptions of their new contexts. The question of what the Nephilim traditions reveal about the nature of religious imagination and its relationship to authoritative texts remains contested among scholars who approach these materials from diverse theoretical perspectives. The interpretive elaborations that transform the sparse biblical references into the rich, mythological traditions preserved in the Enochic literature represent creative engagement with sacred texts that filled gaps, resolved tensions, and generated new meanings beyond what the original compositions contained. This process of interpretive elaboration continued through subsequent historical periods, producing the diverse traditions that have clustered around the Nephilim across Jewish, Christian, and other interpretive contexts. The contemporary proliferation of interpretive frameworks concerning the Nephilim represents a continuation of this process within new media environments and cultural contexts that shape both the content of interpretations and the modes through which they circulate and achieve acceptance. The transformation of the Nephilim from enigmatic biblical references to subjects of elaborate contemporary speculation illustrates the capacity of religious texts to generate meaning far beyond their original contexts and intentions. The interpreters who have elaborated the Nephilim traditions across historical periods have been motivated by diverse concerns, from theodicy and demonology in ancient contexts to conspiracy theory and eschatology in contemporary settings. Yet all have found in these materials resources for addressing questions that mattered within their particular circumstances. The persistence of engagement with the Nephilim traditions across such diverse contexts suggests that something in these narratives continues to resonate with persistent human concerns, even as the specific forms through which that resonance is expressed vary dramatically across historical and cultural settings. The Nephilim stand at the intersection of multiple dimensions of human religious and imaginative engagement, with questions of cosmic order, categorical boundaries, and the consequences of transgression. Their existence in the space between human and angelic realms made them figures of fascination and anxiety within the ancient worldviews that produced the traditions concerning them, and their capacity to embody boundary transgression has ensured their continued relevance within contexts where such transgression remains a source of both attraction and concern. The judgment that eliminated the Nephilim from the earth, while preserving their spirits as sources of ongoing affliction, transformed them from historical beings into permanent features of the spiritual landscape, figures whose influence extended beyond their physical existence to shape ongoing human experience of evil and temptation. The eschatological expectations that anticipate the return of phenomena comparable to those that characterize the antediluvian world ensure that the Nephilim remain relevant to contemporary concerns about the direction of historical development and the nature of events that will precede cosmic transformation. The study of the Nephilim traditions ultimately confronts interpreters with questions about the nature of religious texts and their relationship to historical reality, cosmic truth, and human imagination. The diverse answers that have been given to these questions across historical periods and interpretive communities reflect fundamental differences in understanding of what religious texts are, how they should be interpreted, and what authority they carry for those who engage with them. The continuing debate about the Nephilim within contemporary religious communities demonstrates that these are not merely historical questions about ancient texts, but living concerns with ongoing implications for those who find in these materials resources for understanding their world and their place within it. The giants who walked the earth before the flood, the offspring of unions that should never have occurred, the beings whose existence violated the order of creation, remain figures of enduring fascination precisely because they embody questions that resist final resolution. Whether understood as historical beings whose traces might yet be discovered, as symbolic representations of spiritual realities, as mythological elaborations of psychological truths, or as legendary traditions whose significance lies in their cultural functions rather than their factual accuracy, the Nephilim continue to generate engagement, interpretation, and debate across diverse contexts and communities. Their persistence across the vast temporal span from ancient composition to contemporary elaboration testifies to the capacity of religious and mythological materials to address persistent human concerns in ways that transcend the specific circumstances of their original production. The narrative that began with a few enigmatic verses in the opening chapters of Genesis has expanded across millennia into a vast interpretive tradition encompassing elaborate mythological narratives, theological speculation, contemporary conspiracy theories, and creative elaborations across multiple media. The Nephilim have served as explanations for the origin of evil, as cautionary examples of transgression and its consequences, as subjects of fearful speculation about superhuman powers, and as figures of imaginative fascination whose hybrid nature invites exploration of the boundaries between different orders of being. Their story has been told and retold across centuries and cultures, each retelling shaped by the concerns and assumptions of its particular context while maintaining connections with the textual sources from which it derives. The silence of the received biblical text concerning the Nephilim beyond their brief mention in Genesis and Numbers has paradoxically ensured the continued productivity of these traditions, as interpreters have found in that silent space for elaboration and speculation that more explicit texts might have foreclosed. The gaps in the biblical narrative have been filled by interpretive traditions that have achieved varying degrees of authority across different religious communities, from the canonical status of related materials in Ethiopian Christianity to the influential but non-canonical position of the Enochic literature in other Christian traditions, to the complete rejection of these elaborations within mainstream critical biblical scholarship. The diversity of interpretive frameworks that continue to cluster around the Nephilim reflects the fundamental ambiguity of the original materials and the consequent impossibility of achieving interpretive closure that would definitively establish the meaning of these texts. The Nephilim traditions thus remain living materials, subject to ongoing interpretation, elaboration, and contestation within communities that find in them resources for understanding cosmic order, human nature, and the boundaries that structure existence. The contemporary interest in these materials shows no signs of diminishing, as new audiences discover the traditions through digital media, creative adaptations, and religious teachings that position them as relevant to contemporary concerns. The questions that the Nephilim traditions address about the nature of reality, the structure of the cosmos, the origins of evil, and the boundaries between different orders of being remain questions that human beings continue to ask, and the Nephilim continue to provide frameworks through which such questions might be approached if never definitively resolved. The giants of ancient legend, the offspring of forbidden union, the beings whose very existence transgressed the order of creation, remain present in human imagination, as they have remained present across the millennia since their story was first told, figures of fascination and warning whose meaning continues to unfold in the interpretations of each generation that encounters them. The floodwaters that covered the earth in the days of Noah receded long ago, but the shadows of those who walked the earth before the deluge extend still across the landscape of human religious and mythological imagination, reminding each generation that encounters them of boundaries that exist to be maintained and of consequences that follow when those boundaries are crossed.